find the wording of this one really makes you think. It says the graph of y equals 1 over negative 2x squared minus 0.5 was reflected in the x-axis and its image is shown. So what they're saying right now is that this red graph does not match with that equation. That red graph is the graph that results by taking the original graph, which you don't see, and reflecting it over the x-axis. So if this original graph were blue, it would have been there. So that's the equation of that original graph, and we need to find the equation of that red graph. Well, reflected in the x-axis means that your y values have changed. So that means we would have a negative out in front of our function. And this blue graph would have been our original function. So if we have y equals negative f of x, what we can do is we can write that negative out in front, and that would be out in front of the original function, which is this. Now when we go to simplify this equation, we have to sort of review some work with negatives and work with fractions. So you don't have to copy this down, but down here below I'm going to just take a simpler example of 3 over negative 5. What would happen if I have that negative in front and I wanted to simplify this? What is negative bracket 3 over negative 5 equal to?
Negative 3 over 5.
Okay. Okay. So someone's saying 3 over 5. So what did you do to get 3 over 5? You just know that that's what it is, and so that's why? Or how can one explain if you had this to begin with and you want to say that it's positive 3/5? How would you explain you did that?
3 over negative 5 is a negative number, so we swap that.
Okay. Good. I like that idea. So thinking of 3 over negative 5, having that negative on the bottom of the fraction is the same as that fraction being negative. Whether that negative is on the bottom of the fraction, on the top of the fraction, or in front of the fraction, that all means the same thing. And so when we have a negative in front, a negative times a negative is a positive, so therefore it's 3/5. So that's one way that we could think of that and say, I think this needs to be positive 3/5. Okay? Another way that we can think of this is that negative out in front is like a negative 1. Okay, well that doesn't really help me very much, but if I'm wanting to multiply a fraction by a negative 1, well, when I multiply fractions, I need to multiply the numerators together and multiply the denominators together. So how do I write negative 1 as a fraction? I could write that as negative 1 over 1. And this is important because one of the mistakes that students sometimes make is that you're tempted with this negative out in front to distribute and put the negative to the 3 and the negative to the 5. And I think I heard some of you say that as a suggestion at the beginning. And that can happen. But when we have a negative out in front, a negative 1 is negative 1 over 1. And so when we multiply these together, we'd get negative 3 over negative 5, and then the negatives would cancel out, and we get 3 over 5 again. Or, when you think of that negative 1 out in front, you could have thought of that negative on the bottom. And then when you multiply it, you'd get 3 over 5 as well. So a lot of ways with this simple fraction that we could get to the same result, thinking about it in different ways. The first way was just saying, I know that the inside fraction was negative, so a negative times a negative made it positive. After that, we looked at that negative out in front as a negative 1, and writing negative 1 as a fraction could have that negative on the top of the fraction or that negative 1 on the bottom of the fraction. And it's good to see both of those ways, because in our situation now, when we look at our fraction, there might be one way that's easier. Can we say that this whole fraction is negative? And what would that do? How would that affect the bottom? Or might this be a case where it's going to be easier to put that negative out in front and multiply it through? So let's say you decided to make the fraction out in front a negative 1 and put that negative on the top. Then when you multiply this through, you're going to get negative 1 over negative 2x squared minus 0.5. And that would be right. But if you thought about putting that negative on the bottom and you multiplied it through, now this negative 1 gets multiplied by all of the bottom. So when you multiply it, it will get distributed to both of those. And you'll get 1 over positive 2x squared plus 0.5. And that's also right. Now, I showed you both of those because on your final exam, if you wrote either one of those, you would get full marks. They're not looking for one over the other. It used to be that they would prefer the positive one over the negative one. But now, if you write something that's correct on your final exam, they will take it as correct. But while you're working, whether it's in this class or whether it's in a university class later on, and you're wanting to see how you're doing, what do? You finish a question, you look at the answer to see, did I get it right? And sometimes, especially as you get further on in math, you're going to have an answer that may be right, but doesn't match up with what's the answer in the back of the book. So then you have to decide, is my answer wrong, or can I manipulate mine algebraically to make it match up? So that's what I wanted to point out as some skills here of how you would manipulate and how you would change those. So as far as the nicest looking answer, that one with the positive values probably looks the nicest. As far as questions you can do after this one, 7, 8, 9, and 12. And we're going to do 12 together right now.